Hi everybody, welcome to our second session on mastering the basic math facts with a real focus on multiplication and touching on division as well. So thanks for being back here for this session, and we're going to jump right on into multiplication by 2 and talk about why is 2 the first fact that we're going to focus on, why not 0, why not 1. So hopefully as we work through this professional development it becomes apparent why the certain order of these facts plays in the way it does. So again, I'm Michael Elder, and thank you again for joining me in this professional development. So this is our second chapter. The first chapter, of course, was just our overview. And so I ask you to think, as we get started here, what do you think about when you hear multiply by 2? When somebody says, well, you're going to have to multiply by 2. What kind of experiences do you have with that? I mean, you think about how many different times we do things like double something. It's kind of automatic that, well, I have this and I'm going to double it, or whether it's a recipe or whether it's the money in our pocket, or, well, if I have 1/4 and I double it, then I have 2 and that makes 50 cents. So you just think about all the many experiences we have with multiplying by 2. And I think we have to ask ourselves, is that the same for our kids? In many cases, hopefully it is, and in some cases it's probably not. But if we can tap into some of those experiences that our kids have with multiplying by 2, then we can certainly leverage that with providing them with more experiences. So as we begin any of our multiplication facts, we want to think about pre-assessment as a tool, and what would we be looking for as we pre-assessed. So when we're talking about our 2's, what we're really looking for are those root skills of, can kids identify doubles? Do they recognize the term doubles? Do they know what it means to double something? If I give them two counters, do they know I'm going to double that? That means each one of those counters needs another pair. So then I have 4. And can they see pairs? Do they recognize that these 3 and these 3, well, those pair together? Because that becomes key as we talk about why when multiplying by 2 is it always an even value, right? The idea that things pair up, whether I start with an even number or an odd number, I'm creating a pair for that object, and therefore I always end up with an even number. So as I pre-assess kids, that's really important that I'm looking for, do they understand the concept of doubles? Do they understand what it means to know their pairs? In each of our chapters, we'll talk about what are the big ideas, and you'll notice that in many cases, the big ideas are the same across many of our multiplication facts. The big ideas with 2's are the following, and really it starts with that we recognize, and that kids recognize, that multiplying by 2 is simply a matter of doubling, and that in doubling, what we're talking about, again, is bringing the same number of objects again and then creating a new whole. Another big idea in multiplication in general, right, is that numbers can stand for a variety of things. So just because I'm talking about 2 might refer to the number of coins I have. It might refer to the number of counters. It might refer to the number of rings or the number of toys that I have. And that operation symbols help us determine what the numbers represent. So when we talk about 2 times 3, those operation symbols help me understand I'm talking about 2 groups of 3 objects. And that although 3 times 2 will give me the same value in an answer, those are 2 different things, right? 2 groups of 3 is a very different real object than 3 groups of 2. However, they both tell me I have 6 objects. So the arrangement is different, but the ending value is the same. Another big idea when multiplying by 2 is that, and really multiplying by any value, is that our number system is based upon patterns. And the better we understand those patterns, the more predictable our number system becomes. And the more predictable our number system becomes, the more as a student I know that I can learn it and I can become comfortable with it. One of those examples, of course, being that anytime I multiply by 2, it's even. So we'll look at some examples of that as we get into the activities here in this PD. And then finally, the order of the factors doesn't influence the answer. It does influence what it represents, But the commutative property, we know how powerful that is when we're learning our multiplication facts. That if I understand the commutative property, I certainly I can limit the number of new facts that I have to remember from one unit to the next. So whether I visualize something as 2 groups of 5 or 5 groups of 2, I have the same value. Right? They're two different things, but they have the same value. With each of our multiplication facts, we're going to bring it back to a literature link. So we're going to use the text 2 of everything. And so you might, I'll probably say this every single time, so I apologize, but it's important when we work with kids in math that we give them something to connect back to that isn't necessarily math related, because not all of our kids are going to think about math in terms of digits or even in terms of the concrete objects initially, right? So I want to give kids, whether they're struggling or really highly successful, I want to give them something that we can go back and talk about, and that's where literature can often come in. We're going to use younger literature because typically when we're working with multiplication facts, we're working with younger children. However, we know that we have kids in middle school and high school who are working with their multiplication facts too. So these books may or may not be directly appropriate for what you do or the kids you work with, but hopefully they'll be of some use. And remember that you could substitute any piece of literature, and that you could certainly pull from a novel, right, or from a story online, from a news event, those kind of things. But we're going to use the text 2 of everything, and we're going to do a little read aloud here in just a second because I think it's important to walk through these things. So hopefully a read aloud will give you a chance just to sit back and just enjoy the story. So you may already know the book 2 of everything. And so if I was setting this up for you, if you were my students, then I might ask you to think about some things like, what is something you would like twice as much of? First thing in many people's mind might be money, right? We might like twice as much money or twice as much chocolate in my desk. I might like twice as many cars in my driveway. I might like twice as many houses. Those kind of things. Like just, can you picture wanting twice as much? What goes through your mind? What images are you seeing? Can we chart some of those kind of things out? Again, just trying to get into that idea of doubling something. And if you were my students, can you give me some examples of doubling something or a time that you had something and then you ended up with double that amount? So we're going to read a story now about a couple who finds this magic pot, and the pot doubles everything that falls inside of it. So is this something you would like to have in your house? Would you like to have this kind of hidden in the backyard? Could you have this to be able to use? So what would you put in it if you had this pot? So again, if we're working with kids, we might be charting some of those things out because we're certainly going to use some of those experiences in follow-up. So I am going to flip over to the text here, and let me pull that up here. So let's go to our live image. So this is obviously our book that we're using in creating this professional development. And again, these should be in your school's professional library at this point. So, but the book we're reading right now is 2 of everything. So this book is by Lily Toy Hong, and hopefully again is something or is a text that maybe you have some experience with as well. So hopefully you'll enjoy it a little bit of the read aloud. So let's flip over here. So this is a Chinese folk tale, and again called 2 of Everything, and retold by Lily Toy Hong. Once long ago, in a humble little hut, lived Mr. Hack-Tack and his wife, Mrs. Hack-Tack. They were old and very, very poor. What little they ate came from their tiny garden. In a lucky year, when the harvest was plentiful, Mr. Hack-Tack had a little extra to take to the village. There he traded turnips, potatoes, and other vegetables for things like clothing, lamp oil, and fresh seeds. One spring morning when Mr. Hack-Tack was digging in his garden, his shovel struck something hard. So puzzled, he dug deeper into the ground until he came upon an ancient pot made of brass. How odd, said Mr. Hack-Tack to himself. To think I've been digging here all these years and I never came upon this pot before. I will take it home. Maybe Mrs. Hack-Tack can find some use for it. The pot was big and heavy for Mr. Old Hack Tack. As he stumbled along, his purse, which contained his last 5 gold coins, fell to the ground. He tossed it into the pot for safekeeping, and he staggered his way home. His wife greeted him at the door. "Oh, dear husband, what a strange pot!" Mr. Hack Tack explained how he found the pot. "I wonder what we can do with it," said Mrs. Hack Tack. "It looks too large to cook in, but too small to bathe in." As Mrs. Hack Tack leaned over to peer into that pot, her hairpin, the only one that she owned, fell in. She felt around in the pot, and suddenly her eyes grew round with surprise. "Look!" she shouted. "I pulled out 2 hairpins, exactly alike, and 2 purses, too." Sure enough, the purses were identical, and so were the hairpins, and inside each purse was 5 gold coins. Mr. Hack Tack was so excited he jumped up and down. "Let's put my winter coat in the pot. If we're lucky again, the pot will make 2 coats, and then we'll both stay warm." So into the pot went 1 coat, and out came 2 coats. They began to search the house and quickly put more things into that magical pot. If only we had some meat," wished Mr. Hack Tack, "or fresh fruit, or 1 delicious sweet cake." Mrs. Hack Tack smiled. "I know how we can get anything we want," she said. She put their 10 coins in 1 purse, and she threw it in the pot. She pulled out 2 purses with 10 coins in each. "What a clever wife I have!" cried Mr. Hack Tack. "Each time we do this, we will have twice as much money as before." The Hack Tacks worked late into the night, filling and emptying the pot until the floor was covered with coins. Morning came, and off went Mr. Hack Tack with a long list of things to buy in the village. Instead of vegetables, his basket was full of gold coins. Mrs. Hack Tack finished all of her chores and sat down to enjoy a cup of tea. She sipped on her tea and admired her brass pot. Then, with a grateful heart, she knelt and she embraced it. "Dear pot, I do not know where you came from, but you are my best friend." She stooped over the pot to look inside. At that very moment, Mr. Hack Tack returned. His arms were so full of packages that he had to kick the door open, and bang! Mrs. Hack Tack was so startled she lost her balance and fell head first into the pot. Mr. Hack Tack ran over and grabbed his wife's legs. He pulled and tugged until she slid out onto the floor. But when he looked at the pot again, he gasped. 2 more legs were sticking straight out of it. Naturally, he took hold of the ankles and pulled. And out came a second person, and she looked exactly like his wife. The new Mrs. Hack Tack sat silently on the floor looking lost. But the first Mrs. Hack Tack cried, "I'm your one and only wife. Put that woman back into the pot right now." Mr. Hack Tack yelled, "No! If I put her back in, we won't have 2 women but 3. Oh, 1 wife is enough for me." He backed away from his angry wife, and he tripped and he fell head first into the pot himself. Both Mrs. Hack Tacks rushed to rescue him. Each grasped an ankle, and together they pulled him out. There were 2 more legs in the pot, so they pulled out the other Mr. Hack Tack too. "Just what use does one Mr. Hack Tack have for another Mr. Hack Tack?" cried angrily. "This pot is not as wonderful as we thought it to be. Now even our troubles are beginning to double." But his wife had been thinking while he was busy yelling. "Calm down," she said. "It's good the other Mrs. Hack Tack has her own Mr. Hack Tack. Perhaps we will become the best of friends. After all, we're all so alike. He will be a brother to you, and she'll be a sister to me. With our pot, we can make 2 of everything, so there will be plenty to go around." And this is what they eventually did. The Hacktax built 2 fine new homes. Each home had identical teapots, rice bowls, silk embroideries, and bamboo furniture. From the outside, the houses looked exactly alike, but there was one difference. Hidden in the one house was a big brass pot. Of course, the Hacktax were always very careful not to fall into it again. The new Hacktax and the old Hacktax did become good friends. The neighbors thought that the Hacktax had grown so rich they decided to have 2 of everything, including themselves. And that ends our story. So let's flip back over to our presentation here first. And let's think about how we might use this or embed this into our work with kids, and how we might use this as a kind of a touch point for our kids to think about doubling things and all the different examples that went on there in the story. So one thing that hopefully maybe I modeled in this is that when we're reading a text like this, especially for the first time, we want to make sure that we limit pauses on that first read. It's tempting to stop and talk about the 5 coins in the one bag, and then, oh, look, it doubles, and let's talk about that 5 and 5. But we can certainly do that as we go back through the text, or we might do a second reading or a more close reading. But especially the first time through it, it's important just to appreciate it for the literature piece and to have a chance to really just grasp onto the story and what's going on there. So anytime we share these texts, we're going to kind of go through some of these reminders, like limit pausing. Predicting a little bit is good, but spending a lot of time predicting is probably not the place we want to spend our time. And we really just want to focus on enjoying the story the very first time. And then we can get into focusing on retelling the math as we read it again and again in the future. Once we're finished with reading, then we're going to certainly get into some discussion. And we know in the reality of a math class, this might be something I might read the story on Monday, and then on Tuesday we're going to come back and get into some of the discussion, or maybe we're going to do a closer read if we have multiple copies. So as we look at these discussion questions, please know we totally understand that this might happen over time, right? And that we want to give kids time to think about the story, and also we're really focusing on the math here, right? So we're going to ask things about, like, well, what doubled in this story? Well, how many gold coins fell in there? Well, how many were taken out? How do you know it went from 5 to 10? You can picture that some of your kids might already know that, well, if I have 5 and 5, that just makes 10. Are they adding those 2 things together? Is that kind of an automatic addition fact? Are there any kids who are really picturing 5 times 2 or 2 groups of 5 makes 10? Because those are 2 different thoughts, right? Doing it from an addition standpoint or from a multiplication standpoint. Do you just kind of know some doubles? Kids are going to know some doubles because that's one of the things we do when we add, right? When we learn our addition facts, we're going to talk about that 3 and 3 is a double, and that 4 and 4 is a double. And those are some things kids may have a lot of experiences with. We might ask some questions about, are doubling and twice as much? Are those the same thing? Do we have that language? Is that something we've got to build on? And again, coming back to, can I find doubling or find twice as much by adding? Can I find twice as much by multiplying? And what does that look like as a number sentence? So we're going to have some activities here with the gold coins doubling activity. And really, in this case, what we're looking for is who's already mastered some of these facts and who's going to need more support. So let's take a look at what one of those looks like. And again, I'll try to load these into our online group. But in essence, you can see in the directions here, they're gonna choose a coin bag, right? So I've prepared some of these coin bags. And they're going to write down the letter, so I know which ones, which bags have which number of coins. To show, so they're going to let me know I chose bag C, and therefore I know in bag C there's 8 coins, say, for example. So they're going to count the coins in the bag, and then they're going to figure out, well, how many would I have if I doubled them? They're going to write an addition sentence, and if they can, write a multiplication equation. So this could certainly be a pre-assessment. They could be doing it. Some kids might need, most kids are probably going to need the tangible items. So this would be a good place for two-color counters, for Unifix cubes, for any of those kind of things. But you can see here on the sheet, they're getting 5 opportunities to show us that they know this or that they can figure it out. I would certainly want to be watching to see how they're solving it, because that's sort of as important, more important probably at this point than that they can get the answers. That I'm noticing, are kids adding? Are they multiplying? Do they know how to write the sentences? Because this is something they can do again and again, and we can change the scenario, or it doesn't always have to be gold coins. So again, connecting back to our text, so let's try to draw out what we've seen in the text. So I want to try to get kids using the language, right? It's not just about writing down the multiplication fact. That writing 3x2 equals 6 doesn't mean I understand 3 times 2 is 6, and doesn't mean I'm picturing what's really going on there. So let's take some scenarios, right? Like that we could build based upon the text. So Mr. Hacktack wants to buy a special gift for his wife. So he goes and he picks 6 roses from the garden and he puts them in the pot. Well, how many roses did he get to give to Mrs. Hacktack, and how do you know? Right? Mrs. Hacktack has a busy day and forgets to make dinner, so she found 3 corn muffins and 4 carrots and put them in the pot. Well, what's she going to take out, and how do you know? So a good chance for kids to be able to draw it out and then be able to put the math sentence or the number sentence with what's going on there. And again, repeated practice with doubling, with twice as much. Kids writing their own story problems can be a great experience in terms of ways to follow up with the text. So some of the kids are going to be there, some of them are not. Having kids write their own story problems and create their own multiplication by 2 book as a class can be a good way to provide kids with more practice. It's helping the kids who already know them to give them a chance to write it out, add to their language piece. And the kids who don't already know them, now they have all those problems that their friends wrote for extra practice. So we've mentioned that one of the big ideas is the idea that doubling is creating pairs, right? So if I have 2, I'm creating 2 sets of pairs. 3 is, is pairs of 3 and pairs of 4. So it's 2 groups of a set, right? With older kids, we might talk about that in terms of 2 groups of n, 2 groups of some number, right? So as we're starting to build this idea in kids, how we think about multiplication, multiplication by 2 is finding the total for sets of 2. So if I have sets of 2, right, that means there's 2 in each set. So Mrs. Short baked some yummy brownies. She put 6 plates on the table and she put 2 on each plate. So sets of 2, right? So 2 brownies on each plate. So 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, and 2. 6 plates. How many brownies did she put on the plates, right? Thinking aloud can definitely be one of the places that we're going to get our kids thinking. So I've got my plates, right? So I've got 1, 2, 3. Sorry, my circle's not very good. I'm just trying to draw with the mouse. So 3, 4, 5, and 6. So I've got my 6 plates, and on each plate I've got 2 brownies. So let me put my brownies on my plate. Doot, doot. And again, this is looking at multiplying by 2. This would be 6 groups of 2, right? Groups of pairs. So 6 groups of 2 being 12 versus 2 groups of 6, or doubling 6. This is groups of 2. And as we look at this, one thing is being able to draw it out. Another is being able to connect it to the problem. And then the last bullet kind of asks us to think about this, that groups of 2 and 2 groups of something may get the same value, but they're not the same thing. So this would be, this is Miss Short, yes. So Mrs. Short puts 2 on each plate. Well, is that the same as having 2 plates of 6, right? So visually that becomes 2 very different things, right? So this would be 2 plates of 6 brownies. Not very pretty brownies, sorry. But the 2 plates of 6 brownies, well, this arrangement is very different than the arrangement down here, right? So noticing that difference early on and coming back to that there are times I want 2 groups of 6, and there are sometimes I want 6 groups of 2. Either way, I need 12 brownies, but the way I arrange that is very different, right? And it needs to match the scenario that I'm given. So let's think about kids thinking, right? So here's Mrs. Short again, and she's got her brownies, and she placed 6 plates on the table. She puts 2 on each. How did our kids think through it? Becomes another question. Did they count each brownie, right? I'm not going to redraw them all, but you can think about there's going to be some kids in a class that they count each one. So they're counting 1, 2 on that plate, and then they're counting 3, 4 on this plate, and I'm not going to draw them all out, but 5, 6. So they end up counting all the way to 12. Some kids might skip count, right? So they might say, well, that's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Some kids might write it all out, right? They might say 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2. Again, nothing wrong with any of these strategies. They're all getting the same answer. They're all true to what multiplication is. But we have to recognize that, and we want to honor for kids, that multiplication might not be their first strategy. And this is one of those places that just like, if this is the very beginning of learning multiplication or the very beginning of learning this fact, kids may not choose to multiply. They may choose to add, and they might fight it for a while. I mean, think about the toddler who says, oh my gosh, I can crawl faster, or who's thinking, I can crawl faster than I can walk. Why do I want to walk? Eventually they figure out that walking is more efficient, but it might take it takes some longer to get there, right? So I think the same is probably true when we get into multiplication facts, is multiplication may not be their first strategy, so therefore in teaching, it's helping them connect that the addition that they're doing can also be done by multiplication, and eventually that's going to become more efficient for them. So we want to continue the practice. We want to have that practice with different scenarios that look a lot the same. So it might be a different kind of food. It might be a different number of plates. It might be setting up for a party in the classroom, right? We want to keep coming back to the story, right? So the story gives us lots of examples, lots of places that we can come back to with blocks, with counters. We can act out the scenes in the story, especially with younger kids. They're going to enjoy that kind of thing. And ultimately we'll connect to the representational of the drawings, then the abstract of the number sentences. But we need to remember that by the time we get to 2 times 5, or 2 groups of 5, like for the 2 groups of 5 coins equals 10, this is a highly abstract sentence, right? And if we go here too early, kids get lost in all these symbols and things that to us, after thousands of repetitions, and sometimes we might even feel like, well, that's how I learned it. Sometimes it's not how we learned it, it's just that we remember the very end of what we learned, right? So we remember that this is how we ultimately now remember it. And so sometimes we might have forgotten that somebody showed us a lot of examples early on in that process. So we're going to look at some patterns, right? And we're going to do this a lot of times, or almost with every fact, that writing out the facts and doing this once is probably not enough for the vast majority of kids. So you'll notice here that these are just simply our multiplication by 2s. And we've got our 2 times 1 all the way up through our 2 times 10. You could certainly do 2 times 11 and 2 times 12. Those are common, but in terms of this PD, we said we'd focus on up through 10. So we're looking at this and asking kids, well, what do you notice about these? Do they come up with things like 2 is a factor in every one? It's kind of like counting by 2. You could add up 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 and get the same thing. Everything turns out to be even, right? So these are some of those things. As they're writing their observations, I might notice one thing, but I might also hear someone else share something, and I want to add that to my observations. There's a lot of power in connecting the language to the mathematical representation here. So we're going to continue to go back to counters. We're certainly in those kind of things, array models, all those kind of pieces. But this is really one of the first ventures into just looking at what do the multiplication facts look like. So we might ask some things of some of our kids who are maybe a little further ahead, like, well, what if we switch the order of the factors? If I said 1 times 2 and 2 times 2 and 3 times 2 and 4 times 2, would that change the answers? And again, you'll see different things in different kids. Some kids will be, well, it's different, and some will recognize right away the answer is the same, but they might not be sure why it's the same. And then really getting into more of the depth and complexity, we notice here that all these are even. Is there a way to get an odd answer when multiplying? Could you ever get an odd answer when multiplying by 2, and why? Now, you're not going to hear a third grader most likely talk about, well, if you multiply by a fraction, you could get an odd number, right? Okay, well, it's true. If I take 1/2 times 2, I'm going to get 1. Right? Probably not what we're talking about in this professional development, right? But we want to be careful we're not saying things like, anytime you multiply by 2, you're going to get an even number. Well, not necessarily. When we multiply by our counting numbers, we're always going to get an even number, right? Because of those pairs that we've talked about earlier. So thinking about the commutative property and thinking about what it would look like, it's one thing to say 2 times 3 and 3 times 2. It's another thing to picture it. So in the same way that we did with the brownies, how are these two scenarios different? Can students draw these out? Can I give them a variety of these scenarios and have them practice? What does 2 baskets with 3 apples look like? And what does 3 baskets with 2 apples? Does he have the same amount of apples in both? In fact, I might just give them the 6 apples or 6 plastic objects and say, what would it look like? What would it look like in each scenario? And then not ultimately, but in some part of this process, I might ask kids to write a double story. So we could create our very own hack-tack, 2 of everything kind of story. Maybe we make it centered around a topic we're studying, whether it's something in science or social studies. Might be a good place to bring that in. Maybe a theme that we're looking at in terms of a big idea in our school. Using the model of the story, that something is doubling everything, but what kind of things could double? Maybe it's animals going on a journey. Maybe it's something similar to that. So giving kids a chance to create their own story, to illustrate all those kind of things, again, takes time, but it's also bringing in other standards, right? So now we're practicing the representation through a variety of means, and certainly could bring in some technology as well. Now, once we've reached a point where kids understand the representation of multiplication, so I'll say this and say it with the caution that once they understand how to picture it and they can draw these things out, then it's time to start building automaticity. One thing we have to be careful about is not trying to build automaticity too quickly. So especially when working with younger kids or kids that just don't have a picture of what's going on, jumping to making it automatic and math fact practice sheets and those kind of things can really throw some kids off. It can turn them off to it, and it's not something that cannot be reversed, but it is something that we have to be careful that we've built the understanding of doubles, we've built the understanding of groups, and now we're going to need to do some targeted practice. The keys that we're going to suggest, both from the text and from our experience and from the research, is it needs to be very short in duration, a couple minutes repeated throughout the week. It needs to be a routine part of math time. So it's not something we do maybe just on Mondays every week, but there's math fact practice time, not math fact assessment time. And recognizing that if we're doing fact sheets, those are assessments, they aren't practices. So practicing writing out the facts is really much more of an assessment task than it is a practice test. So think about the things we were just doing, creating the books, drawing things out, having discussions, doing some of the games we're going to walk through here in a second. Those are work to build automaticity. we know the power of games for ourselves. We know we can play a game for hours, but we are not going to attend in the same way to a worksheet, right? So kids are the same way. There are certainly some websites that help us do that. But we want to encourage active engagement, right? So let's look at some of those things that we can add to our tool set if we don't already have them. So this comes from page 38. This is called rolling for doubles. So kids would roll their dice or their number cube. They're going to double it and they record it on their sheet. And so after 3 rolls, then the person with the largest sum wins around. So now we're also practicing our addition, right? So we're going back and reaching into our ability to add these things up. So you could certainly use a number cube with more than just 1 through 6 on it. There are a variety of those out there, right? So we're going to double it, and we're going to play this repeatedly. So I'm going to play somebody. I can get 6 practices in. Again, this could be that 3 minutes, 5 minutes of practice for me as a student, and it actually kind of is fun. So this next activity being called double up, right? So the goal is to be the first person to find 6 different products of 2. So we're going to get a deck of dot cards. We're going to pull out a card, write down the number. So I pull out a card, I get a 4, I write down the 4, and I double it on my game board. So the product, though, can only appear once on the game board. So what does that look like? Okay, so these are double up dot cards. So I create these, I put them in a little Ziploc bag for my kids. The directions are on the sheet, right? So I pull out my card, there's my 4, so I get my 4, I take 4 times 2, that gives me 8, right? We shuffle them up, the next person grabs theirs, they fill theirs in, and we continue doing this, right? If I pull the 4 again, I can't do that turn, so I lose that turn. And the first player who gets their chart filled with 6 different products. So in essence, what we're doing is we're forcing the kids to practice 6 different facts, right? But the reality we know with probability is they're going to pull some of the same ones and go, oh man, 4 times 2, I already have 8. And they've just practiced that fact again, right? So this is called double up. When we think about fact cards, we think about building fact fluency in that way, it's okay in moderation. But I always want to remember that it's not a race, right? I'm not racing against everybody else in the class. I'm not doing 60 seconds of these facts and hoping that I can get them all done so I can move on to the next fact. The person I'm racing against is myself, right? So as we think about fact practice, it's okay to build speed, but we also have to be careful we're not building anxiety. And too often that happens, and then kids check out way too early in their educational career. So when we think about student fact deck cards, what's going to happen with this text is kids are going to build their own deck, right? So as I progress, I might progress more slowly than my neighbor, and that's okay because I have my own practice cards. So if I pair up with my neighbor, they're going to use my cards to help me or to quiz me, and I'm going to use theirs. So it's personalized or it's differentiated in that way. So we'll look at that as we go through our different facts here. But what I'm doing is, as I am ready for a new fact, the whole class might be learning about their 6s this week, but I might still be practicing my 2s because I may not be there yet. So it's okay for me to do the activities with other facts, but I need to also have time to go back and practice and spend some time in the activities for the fact that I'm really working on. I wouldn't add those 6s that the class is working on to my deck because I would still be on the 2s, and I'd be doing my 2s and my 3s and my 0s and my 1s and those pieces first. So in the handouts, there is a template for the cards, which are just the simple multiplication fact cards for 2. So you can picture what those look like, 4 times 2 and 2 times 2 and 3 times 2. So one way to make that a little more interactive and to connect it to what kids need to know with the number line would be to use an activity like this. It's called fact card jumps. So they're writing their multiplication fact on the line above the number line and then drawing it out. So if I got 4 times 2, then I might draw 4 groups of 2, right? So I'm going to go use my little pen here. So I've got 1 group of 2, right, and 2 groups of 2, and 3 groups of 2, and 4 groups of 2. And so on my line up here, I've written 4 times 2, and then I've shown down below that that equals 8. Right? And then I can record that, and we can go back and forth, or we're drawing out of our practice packet. This one is called doubles matchup, and again, these are all meant to help build automaticity. So kind of think about concentration here, right? So I'm trying to match up the number sentence, right, the addition sentence, with the multiplication sentence, and then with a representational picture of that object. So I can see that 1 plus 1 is 2, right? And then I would be trying to find that, well, then that matches up with 2 groups of 1 is 2, and that would end up matching up with the picture, 2 groups of 1 is 2, right? So I've got to match up all 3 pieces to it. You could certainly just have 2 on one day, you got the pictures and the addition sentence, and then add in the multiplication, or you could try all 3 of them, right? So again, just another way to practice my facts. Throughout this, it's important that we as the teachers are monitoring progress and keeping tabs on how kids are doing, how they're progressing. These little fact reviews are one way to monitor automaticity, right? Time is not as important as sometimes we make it. We're not comparing my work to another student's work. I'm comparing my work to kind of the benchmark. So I might as a teacher decide there's a certain amount of time, but I might even vary that for different groups of kids depending on where I see that where I want their progress to be over a certain amount of time. I definitely want to focus on beat my own record as a motivator versus something external to me. We'll talk about some of those pieces as we go through over the next couple weeks. So our connection to division is almost always going to be approaching it through some of the same activities, but flipping the activity. So if we think about the text that we use, we'll get into some of those examples, but what we really want kids to come to realize is that if I know 2 groups of 5 is 10, and then I'm asked to figure out something like 10 divided by 2, well, what am I really asking? Well, I'm asking how many groups of 2 are there in 10? And that I've already answered. There are 5 groups of 2 and 10. Oh, I already know that, right? This is really just spinning around the multiplication. Generally speaking, that's how most people do division, right? We generally try to think of the multiplication sentence. We don't usually think of 56 divided by 7. Sometimes we might think 56 divided by 7 is 8. But a lot of times we're going to think, well, 7 times what is 56, and work backwards that way. Either way is certainly fine, but for a lot of our kids, if they're struggling, connecting it back to something they already know is a more smooth pathway for them. So same kind of example, right? So if I have 2 groups of 5, I get 10. But if I have 10 and I split it into 2 groups, then I have 5 in each group, right? So 2 times 5 is double the 5, but 10 divided by 2 is splitting 10 in half, right? So connecting that back to manipulatives, it isn't going to happen on one day. Just because I know my multiplication facts doesn't mean I'm going to, oh, well, then I've got my division facts too. It's going to take those same reverse kind of practices. But ultimately, I want kids to realize that what dividing by 2 is that, well, it's splitting it into 2 groups. So it's splitting it in half, right? So I can think of it in that way. And that brings us kind of to the end of our session here today. So what are your next steps? Well, this is one of the places where I turn it over to you and ask, well, it kind of depends on where you are with this process. So sometimes we will have a very specific task for you to do. In this case, this is going to be very open-ended for you. I'm going to ask you to either try out a game, to prep a game. It might be that you say, oh, I love this, but I couldn't use these games until next year. So maybe you're going to prep them for next year. So you could totally reply to this assignment and say, I prepped these 3 activities for next year, or I'm trying these 2 activities with kids who are struggling. You could also just turn this into a discussion. If it's better for you to just reflect on how you think about multiplying by 2 and put that in the assignment. So I want this to feel open enough that it fits where you are. If that's too confusing, because I know sometimes the more open we make things, that makes it a little more confusing. So if that's the case, let me know, and I'll be glad to work with you on that. You then will click Submit Assignment, and you'll share what we just discussed there after you view this presentation. So that gets us through multiplication by 2. We'll be posting multiplication by 10 here in the next very shortly. So thank you very much for your time and your attention, and we will see you the next time online.